Welcome to A Culture of Curiosity, a podcast delving into the school experiences of millions of children around the world. This is a curious podcast for educators by educators. And I'm Jack, a belonging and inclusion specialist.
And I'm Maureen, a former head teacher and now leadership coach and SEN specialist. We're talking all things inclusive education, creating a culture of curiosity around situations and dynamics that exist in every school, every day.
So whether you're a teacher, leader, or just passionate about creating schools where every child gets to belong, you've ended up in the right place. So I reckon we should start with, how did we get here? How is it that we've got to this balmy place where we're using fancy podcast software? We've both bought jazzy microphones. Maybe we should tell the world about why we're doing this.
Well, I think that it was LinkedIn, wasn't it? The power of LinkedIn. Because
the power of LinkedIn.
I think actually I remember you posting something that really struck a chord with me.
In a good way.
Of course it's in a good way. And we sort of connected because we both work for Theme Teach. And that's how we were connected. But you'd posted something about being at some event or other. And that moment of sort of where someone had said, what does your wife do? Or something weird like that.
Oh, yeah.
And yes, and obviously you then talked about, the unthinking questions and how they can sort of, sometimes you can sort of shake them off and then other times they can really get to you. And I thought, yeah, I really, that resonated with me. And I just put some comment underneath. And I think very quickly the conversation I felt needed to go to DM because I think I suspected one of us was about to start sharing stuff we might not want out in the open or at least might be seen as a bit sensitive. And then it carried on from there, really. I think that's my recollection, unless you're about to tell me something completely different.
No.
It was a whole other meeting some other time that I just can't remember.
No, I remember because we train for a similar organisation as part of what we do as professionals. Obviously, your name comes up in conversations, and I always tell people about the day that I fell in love with Mo and Maureen. I should clarify that they're not two separate people. But it was I was delivering a course in Stockport, and you live not too far from Stockport, and we met up. And I think one of the first things we talked about was that we both had this innate desire to create a podcast that we maybe didn't think existed or that we'd not come across just yet, if it does. And both of our personalities meant that within days of that conversation, it very quickly snowballed into a real thing. And I think that it's probably fair to say that at different moments, we both had moments of panic going, oh God, this is really happening. We've possibly overcommitted. And now we're here.
I'm going to have to put my money where my mouth is and stop talking about things I want to do and actually do them. Oh my God. And there's someone there who's prepared to hold me accountable.
Yeah. And that's something I think we've done very well. We've held each other accountable and got to a point where we're recording the blooming thing. So hats off to us, I think.
Absolutely.
What better evidence for the power of connection, right?
Yes.
The way in which that LinkedIn brought us together, and that's it. We've not been able to kind of escape each other's lives ever since in the best and most beautiful way.
And I remember there was a conversation that we were having because my experiences as a black woman who was born, who's born in the 60s, went to school in the 70s and 80s and became a teacher in the 90s onwards. And your experience as a young gay man, we realised there was an awful lot in common, and we had that wonderful phrase, didn't we, where it was, I've not walked a mile in your shoes. You've not walked a mile in my shoes, but we got our shoes from the same shoe shop. And that was the point where the connection became complete, wasn't it?
Yes, it's such an interesting thing, isn't it? Because I think about that quote, that phrase a lot. And I'd never heard it before you said it to me. And it's really,
That's
really
I made it up.
This is it. But
it's a Mo original.
It's a Mo original. You're going to have to copyright it and put it on a tote bag if you really want to sell it as original. But it's so interesting, isn't it? Because when we talk about connection, when we think about, inclusion and belonging, and sometimes we get a bit bogged down in the idea of trying to prove and offer data, and it's exactly that analogy that while we might not wear the same shoes, we shop in the same shoe shop. But it's the shop that brings us together. It's the shop that can underpin that kind of connection. And I really, really love that. I wouldn't have it any other way. I think I said to you, it's not quite as profound of a quote, but that I refer to myself in your life as a bit like a bad smell, that now that we're connected, you'll never quite be rid of me. I don't know that one would do as well on a tote bag. I said the same thing to my husband. So now that we are officially podcasters, I'm going to pop that into my LinkedIn experience. We'll work towards the term influencer, but we'll settle with podcaster for now. How we've talked about ways that we'll structure our episodes, because Lord knows the pair of us need structure, but you had a really interesting idea around something that we could do either together or with the lovely guests that we've got coming up in this season, to kind of connect with each other. I think you've got to tell the world about it.
It's called a thought tickle. And it's a question that's tickled you. It's a question that we're going to sort of kick off every week with just something to get us thinking, something to get us curious, because obviously the podcast is about a culture of curiosity. And so this week's thought tickle is a question for you, Jack, is tell me the most random thing that you have Googled this week and why you Googled it.
Oh, gosh. I spend a lot of my time thinking that reviewing my own search history in the most appropriate of contexts is probably never a good thing. Because it's the intrusive thoughts that align with my ADHD, where I think I've got to know that right now. I think the most random thing I've probably Googled in the last week. So in the last week, I've moved house, and moving house is forever an awful thing. I don't know why we do it. And it's not until you start getting ready to move that you realize just how much rubbish you've acquired. Sure. And my random Google was that, as we were getting ready to pack up the kitchen, we noticed that there was a tiny sort of leak in the corner of the ceiling. And me sort of playing Bob the Builder thought, well, I can definitely deal with that. And
yes, you can.
I liked that. The onslaught of Google searches in response was absolutely wild. And what I found myself was spending hours on a YouTube channel of a really lovely man who was kind of offering all kinds of practical sort of dad-themed advice about plumbing and sealant and all these kinds of things. So I think that was probably mine.
I find those sorts of YouTube channels really, really soothing. You just get this usually a man, and usually an older man, just calmly walking you through step by step things that might as well be written in Tagalog. It might as well be written in this completely alien foreign language. I've got I'm not handy at all. But these people just seem to make it so simple and that sort of, you feel, yeah, I could do that. I'm sitting there and thinking, yeah, I could strip a boiler. I couldn't ever strip a boiler. But they just have you believing that you can do all of these things. Yes. Did it fix the ceiling at all?
Oh no, absolutely not. It was completely out of my skills remit. But I feel quite empowered in the knowledge that I've acquired should there be a leak in future.
The thing is, I know what will happen now, because it's human nature, is if you start talking to somebody and they mention a leak, you'll start giving them an advice like you're an expert now.
Absolutely. That's if you check my LinkedIn in a couple of days, it will talk about my work, my podcasting / influencing, and my newly found DIY abilities.
Fantastic.
There's talking points thing on LinkedIn. It's DIY and plumbing. That'll be me. So you've got to tell me then, what's the most random thing you've Googled this week?
I can tell you this because it only happened a couple of days ago.
Right.
It was a search for a word, you know, when you're looking for the right word for something, but it was something I was writing. So I actually Googled, how do you spell ubiquitous?
I've got no idea.
But I'd spelt it correctly. It made no
Right.
sense. It made no sense. If I'd Googled, what does ubiquitous mean?
Yeah.
That might, just to check,
Perfectly
because it's
valid
one of those
search.
words. It's one of those words, isn't it? You say it, and it's one of those that I think feels really nice in your mouth, if that makes sense. And so you say it, and then you think, I'm pretty sure it means all-encompassing and everything, everything, everywhere, all at once, as it were. But let me just double check, because I don't want to write it down and then someone say, "What do you mean by ubiquitous?" But I didn't. I actually Googled, how do you spell it?
So what you're telling me is that you didn't turn to Google for support in knowledge. You turned to Google in support of validation of your existing knowledge. You just wanted Google to say, "Well done, Mo. You've already spelt it right. Pat on the back to you."
I'm showing off to Google. That's basically what I'm doing there.
I quite like that. I'm going to try that on my next bad day. Worst case scenario, I'm just going to start spitting facts at Google that I already know to be true, just for the validation that I do roughly know what I'm on about.
Fantastic.
I really
Well,
like
if nobody, that's a sort of being your own cheerleader, isn't it, really?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I love that. I really, really like that. But it's an interesting thing. I really like that question, because we were talking a bit about why we started this podcast, how that we connected, and what it is that we wanted from the podcast. And I think it's really profound that we've started with the idea of connection, that not only are we have become connected and we share that similar connection, that the podcast for us was about connecting with others around what we're calling this kind of a culture of curiosity, this kind of place where we can really play around with the ideas of what it is that we mean by inclusion and belonging in education and schools. Because they're big buzzwords, right? They are so talked about at the moment. We're waiting to see whether or not, or how Ofsted are likely to include inclusion as part of its framework, and we'll possibly save that discussion / rant for another episode. But what we wanted to do was kind of create something that I think we both would have appreciated at different points in our own careers. Where we could kind of create a space that we could have a laugh and have a giggle, talk about the things that we were facing, and consider how they lived and breathed, and maybe how we move them forwards.
Absolutely. I mean, from my own experience, I was a head teacher for 21 years. Working in special schools, PRUs, APs, etc. And it's funny, because all through my time at school, I was very aware that I was othered, very aware that I was very much, there were hardly any people who looked like me walking around, and most of them I was related to. They were either my siblings or my cousins, going to the same school. And that sort of battle of sort of existing in a world that really wasn't designed for you. And there didn't seem to be much leeway in allowing you in. If anything, it was just resistance. And you sort of think, oh, this won't be like that when I'm an adult. This won't be like that when I grow up and I'm doing whatever. It's part of my school life. But then I went back into school and I became a teacher. And it carried on when I was a teacher. It carries on it's carrying on in the staff room as much as it is in the classroom. Maybe not the quite blatant bullying that exists, but that just thoughtlessness of how easy is it to actually include me? So is it a conscious choice not to? And at some point you've got to consider whether it is a conscious choice not to include, not to connect, not to have that feeling of belonging.
You're right, because I think in lots of ways, for those of us working sort of in and around any kind of, supportive childcare led provision, we've all had the moment where we think, why on earth did I think this was a good idea? Especially when we've all had our own individual wobbly experiences at our own time at school. I remember walking down the first corridor of the first ever school I went back to, thinking, why did I think this was a good idea? I had such a turbulent and awful time at school that's had such a profoundly negative experience on my life, that why did I think this was a good idea? But I think, again, one of the things that connects a lot of people within the education industry is probably that same reason, isn't it? To make sure that we can do our bit to hope and move towards a place where experiences that we had to endure, and we use the word endure very specifically, but we come back in the desperate hope that we can be part of a solution. We can be part of the reason that means those experiences we endured and went through as young people aren't things that are continued, and that aren't things that continue to impact and influence and traumatize, in some instances, the children attending.
Absolutely. You go. I remember coming back into schools, and obviously not the same school, as a teacher, and walking in, and it was very much. It was always part of my own healing. I think I need to sort of heal the inner child, if I'm going to get deep about it, because until I go back, that's not going to actually go away. My relationship with school and education is going to be fixed in that point of time. So there was a little bit where I did it for myself, but also I wanted to be the person I needed. I wanted to be that person who saw me. Do you know what I mean? Who saw that child, who saw the struggle, who saw the vulnerabilities, who saw their need, and let them know that they saw it. Because I suspect there probably were people for both of us. There were adults in schools who did see our struggle, who did see our issue, but never actually did anything about that, never let us know that.
Yeah. And that, I think that's really beautiful, isn't it? It's such a beautiful reason to have that calling for the roles that we play and the jobs that we do. But it's phenomenally difficult. We know that, teaching and working in education specifically is by no means an easy feat. No. But then to carry the weight of your own experiences and the kind of healing and process, that's quite a responsibility, I think, to be able to sometimes have to check your own experiences as they're influencing, how you're responding and what comes next. And that's tough.
I was talking about this in a training course I was delivering on Wednesday. And we were talking about what pushes children's buttons about the behaviour of adults in schools. And I added one in, the superhero pushes their buttons, and it was a care setting, it wasn't an education setting, and they sort of looked at me a little bit oddly, and I said, no, we have to be honest with this. We have all come across people, usually, and this isn't to decry agency staff. It's because it happens when someone first meets everybody and doesn't actually with the relational approach, but they think they do, and they come steaming in on day one. I'll have a word with him. If there's something, they'll see a child, they'll hone in on them and start giving them this superhero talk about how you can do it, you can this, you can that. Probably barely have bothered even to introduce themselves. And the kids sit in there thinking, I have had so many people like you come across who decide that they know what my issue is, and here's the solution, and all it's going to take is coming from you, that I'll suddenly see the error of my ways and everything's going to be changed. I can imagine just how annoying it would be if you're a child in school today, especially if you're outside of the mainstream. So you've already been identified as having social, emotional, mental health needs, or you're a child in care, or whatever. And this parade of strangers who assume the right to just talk at you like they know your life inside out.
Absolutely. It's such a, and I think you've kind of teed us perfectly into what it is that we're talking about this week. You'd think that we'd rehearsed this, and I love that we haven't. We actually didn't record this bit and practice. Yeah. But that power of connection, the kind of connection that we share and that we've talked about, at the moment, I think, when we think about, I mean, I'll be honest, I try not to watch the news. I turned all the news apps off on my phone. But something that's being regularly talked about is kind of behaviour in schools, and
Yes.
that behaviour in schools is largely responsible, or is assumed or accused of being largely responsible for part of the crisis we have around recruitment and retention of the wonderful professionals and teaching staff that make up our schools across the country. And it's so widely talked about, but we talk about behaviour as this idea of sometimes things that are done to us, as if behaviour is done to us with cognitive choice,
Yes.
with real intention. And don't get me wrong,
Yeah.
Sometimes the functions of some of the behaviour that we see play quite nicely into this narrative around intention, but that beauty of connection and relationships, that I think if we think about our own school experiences, there's hopefully, I can think of one person who I was genuinely connected to. It was a real connection, and it was a connection that could span the really lovely few and far between moments I had in school, and the really nitty gritty, sobbing underneath tables, kind of, the wobbly moments. But it was that connection and that relationship that endured. And then if you think about the people that you didn't connect with, or the people that you had quite negatively influenced relationships or connections with, I often think it's those people that we can recount like that. It's the information, the teeny tiny granular details. They feel a lot more available than maybe the ones that we were positive with.
When I was running pupil referral units, which, children who'd been permanently excluded from school, they came to us, and time after time after time, they would, almost in passing, just recount with what I could absolutely be certain was word for word accuracy, some unthinking, terrible sentence that an adult had said to them in the school, that clearly, regardless of what they'd done at the time, it was clearly something that had hurt and still kept on hurting, even, months and maybe even years after. They could recount word for word the sentences, the situation, the person, where they were, who was around them, because it stays with you. The negative, it's a stain, and unless you do something to get rid of that, that's never going to go away. And sometimes the thing that you need to do is simply acknowledge that it's there. And sometimes you need to do more about it, but to pretend that none of us have those things is totally unrealistic, which is why when, as you're saying about the news and people making comments about behaviour and all those other things, and I just think they must have had themselves experiences that caused them pain, that caused them anxiety, that has shaped their view or their approach or their confidence or their choices. Everybody has had those happen to them at school at some time or another. Even if you are seemingly this high school hero, captain of the football team, most popular, best looking person going around, at some point you're...
But you didn't have to brag about me there, Maureen. That was fine, but thank you.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't me, Jesus, no. But I think at some point that people talk about that bringing its own pressures. People talk about actually realizing that your life has peaked at the age of 16 and it's all downhill from there. There is some legacy even when you are the top dog in school. So I just cannot get my head round how adults who, and especially adults who have been given some sort of voice or authority to speak on these matters, can talk as though that never happened to them, or they're completely unaware of the power of connection and the damage of disconnection.
I think you're right. I think it's hard, isn't it? Because what I think what we're not doing for sure is discrediting the frustration that some, trying to offer support to a classroom full of 30 plus children, if we're talking about mainstream provision, that children being children, sometimes they get it wrong. They have days that are wobblier than others. They can be here, there, and everywhere, and we get that. That can be tough. It requires a bucket load of patience and endurance, and we're not discrediting the fact that
No,
it can
not
be
at
really
all.
frustrating.
Not at all.
But I think what we're talking about also is moving past this idea of behaviour being something that's done to us, and behaviour actually being something that we start to wonder a bit more about. That often there's this idea around, I always give this analogy when I'm talking to people about behaviour, that when we talk about animal behaviour, I think what often comes to mind for people is often David Attenborough, his wonderful voice. And often what David Attenborough does is give us context around what it is that the animal behaviour does and what it seeks to achieve, the way that animals survive, the way that animals cohabitate, the way that they navigate the world in which they exist in. But when we talk about human behaviour, often it's done with the caveat that we're about to tell you something really awful and scary and grisly. Or if as the member of staff having to make a phone call home, if you were to say the words down the phone, "Hi Mo, it's Jack at school. Can I have a quick word with you about your child's behaviour?" I would say for the majority of people on the other end of that call, they're waiting for me. That something's gone wrong, that I'm not happy.
Yes.
And I can't fathom that. I can't figure out why it's so different.
Behaviour isn't actually a bad word. It isn't actually negative. Behaviour is just how we act in situations, depending on what our life experiences are, what the context is, what the reactions we have had from people, the feelings that we have at the time, the experiences we've had in the past, that all of those things result in our behaviours, and they are equally positive as they are negative at any given time, but the focus is on the negative, and then you start talking about people thinking about discipline and thinking about, I must make you comply and I've got to win, and it just gets horribly warped, really, I think, for want of a better word, and the narrative becomes one that behaviour is a bad thing, and there can be seemingly positive behaviours that are actually evidence of some real damage going on. You can get someone who is overly a people pleaser, and that can come from a point of anxiety. It could come from a point of having witnessed violence and abuse in their home life, in their formative years. It could be from a whole number of things, and yet the teacher in the day-to-day, and I'm not just having a go at teachers, I'm not, but in schools, I should say, how it manifests itself is the child who sits there at the front, answers all the questions, hands up straight away, will volunteer to help with everything, will do all these things that on the surface is ideal behaviour. But actually, they're masking just as much as the child who is swearing and kicking up a fuss and not doing things and who's disorganised and what have you, aren't they? It's the same, it's manifestations of the same traumas, but in different ways.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting comparison. I think a lot, I don't love the word control. We do hear it used quite a lot, that I prefer the term autonomy. But if we're going to use the word control, I think we all like to be in control. We all like to get our own way. We all like to kind of satisfy and address our own needs. And you're right, children that present and communicate in a way that seems, quite advanced for their years. The kids that we meet where we go, gosh, that's, 13 going on 30.
Yeah.
That again, very rarely does that happen for a good reason. That often we see people try to emulate and acquire behavioural communication that doesn't belong to them. Because it's associated with control and autonomy, and we buy into this narrative, don't we, that control and autonomy equals safety.
Yes.
But this idea, if we flip that idea of how it is we keep people safe, or we look to operate a safe provision, sometimes the idea there is that, well, that means we've got to be in control. And the way that we're in control is that we're distanced. We use discipline. We use quite stringent measures around punishment, that I will shame you into learning. And while that's probably not the intention, or at least I hope it's not, that actually that balance isn't right. And we know that there is a wealth of data and evidence to suggest that it's relationships. If we're going to go after anything that underpins a young person's academic performance and success, it's relationships. It's relationships that allow us to show up day after day.
Yes, absolutely. It's having somebody there who you know gets you. And I know that's really simplifying it, but having the feeling that there are people in the world that you don't have to perform for, that you don't have to act in a way that is uncomfortable or alien to you. You can be yourself. Good, bad, and ugly, you can be yourself.
Yeah. And that takes a lot of strength to be vulnerable, doesn't it?
Yes.
You know, I was in a school a couple of weeks ago, and they'd had this extension built, and it was really lovely. We were studying what was going to be the sort of new staff area, and they had these stunning windows, and we could watch people coming into school. So we were watching some kids that were toddling around from, around the corner coming in, some people being dropped off at gates by parents and carers. And it was really interesting that there was something about the threshold. There was something about kind of watching, kids and young people mess around in the sort of park and land that sat in front of the school site and knock about with their brothers and sisters and their mates. And then it was honestly quite bizarre watching them kind of step onto the playground. And it was like they kind of acquired this presentation of who they had to be at school. And I think there would be arguments in some circles that that's a wonderful thing, that we know that behaviour does kind of modulate depending on environment and circumstance. I remember the first time I met my in-laws and the bizarre and prim and proper ways in which I tried to navigate that dinner. But I think that was driven by me wanting to connect and wanting to kind of...
You want that approval?
Yeah, absolutely. But it wasn't about a kind of permanent expectation that I would be somebody that I wasn't.
Yes.
That if I didn't fit here, then it wasn't going to work out. And I think that's where the worry is, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I remember when, again, my time improves because you have this constant stream of young people and all of them had this experience of rejection. The mainstream system, the school system that they had been in had found them wanting to the extent that the decision was made that they did no longer belong. And I used to do the inductions of every single child that came in. And one thing I always said to every single child in the induction phase was, and family, because there's a whole other conversation about how it's actually a whole family's relationship that's damaged with education, that's damaged when you permanently exclude a child. But I used to say to the kids, a person was created in your last school that was labelled as rude, violent, lazy, stupid, whatever, and I'm using horrible words on purpose here. You get to take that jacket off here. The outside world, in the streets, in your former school, you've created this persona, and there is absolutely no way, and I used to sort of say, you can not believe me or you can believe me. It depends on where you are in your own journey. But there is absolutely no way it's a jacket that you choose to wear and one that you enjoy wearing all the time. So this is a place where the second you walk through the door, you've taken that jacket off. And you can either choose to keep it outside and keep putting it back on, or you can choose to use this time to learn and create a new jacket for yourself so that when you go back into your next school, you've got a completely different jacket on.
I really love that analogy because I like the idea of being able to take the jacket off, and sometimes we put the same jacket back on when that jacket can be appropriate and helpful and and sometimes we've got to create new jackets. But I think, back to this idea of connection, that for a lot of young people, especially when they've moved from one provision to another for a variety of reasons, but sometimes the barrier to connection for them is the jacket that they come with. And sometimes our urgency to see that jacket because, you know, as a species, we like to be right, don't we? We like to have the moment of going, oh, I was correct. Thank goodness for me. That, you know, Mo comes to join my class and somebody says to me, well, watch out for Mo. You know, she might do this. And then I worry about it and I overthink it. And sometimes I inadvertently provoke it. And then you show me that behavior and I go, huh, I was right. I knew you were going to do that. Yeah. And the problem there is you never get to take the blooming jacket off, whether you wanted to or not. You never get an opportunity because that jacket becomes the reason that maybe I'm not looking to connect with you because I'm perceiving it to be a barrier. I'm perceiving it to be the reason that we won't connect.
You could get a lot of that inadvertently through the referral and transition process, don't you? And
absolutely.
I did some research many years ago now with an educational psychology team in the local authority that I worked with, interviewing teachers and pupils and families around exclusion. And there was a teacher that said what had a round table with about 5 or 6 different teachers from various mainstream schools, and they weren't the pastoral team, they weren't the behavior, they were just they were standard subject deliverers at secondary. And I one of them just said something that just struck me so deeply. He said he was talking. The question was about their feelings, exploring their feelings about in-year transitions, because I call them in-year transitions to try and take the sting out of it, you know. And he said, well, the thing is, they give themselves away before they even get there. You know, the children, blaming the children. They give themselves away before they even get there. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, all all you've got to do is wait for someone to say the word fresh start. Or see it written down, fresh start. And all you can think about is what they did to dirty it in the first place.
And that's hard to avoid. And the worst thing is, you know, and when I say hard to avoid, it's hard for the child or young person to avoid because they're often not part of those conversations. They don't get much influence over those opportunities. And it means
before you've even met the person, you're thinking. So when you meet this child, you're naturally filtering for evidence of the things they did to dirty their reputation.
Yeah, and you're right. It's we talk a lot about language, don't we? And I sometimes get into what I'll call debates. Some might call arguments. Around why language is important. And you know, when we think about language, I don't want to take the argument so far that it trivializes the point to such a degree that we've lost sight of what it was we were you know, considering in the first place. But language is so important and it has such a wealth of impact. But for some, language can be something that they feel, you know, as practitioners, that we might get to feel we have some influence over. We know that there are really big systemic barriers for some young people in terms of how they access and experience education. And for some of us, that can feel a million years away, that there's no way me in my world can have some kind of effect on that. But what I can have effect over is the words that I use tomorrow. Absolutely. And those labels stick. They really, really stick and they scratch away. I left school, oh gosh, how long ago? I left school nearly 20 years ago. And I think a lot...
Jack, hang on. Before you start going on about... I was already a head teacher 20 years ago. So let's not play who's the ancient one here, because you know that I win.
I wasn't playing that game. I should have took bets onto how early into season 1 we were going to identify the disparity and difference in our age. But I think it's so many years later after school, the phrase that sticks in my head is too much. You know, Jack, why do you have to be too much? Why is this so difficult? Why can't you just be like everybody else? Why do you have to be too much? And years and years and years later, it still really impacts sometimes the way I feel about myself, the opportunities that it gets in the way of sometimes. And that's huge.
That is such a weapon to throw at a child, at anyone. Yeah. But at that vulnerable age of your teens, you're too much. Actually, I'm not enough, rather than you're too much. So you're blaming me because you feel inferior. It's like I get, and mostly through my professional adult life, I got told that I was intimidating. And for too many years that I'm actually comfortable with, for far more years than I was comfortable with, my response to that was to work out how I could be less intimidating to people. So I would be quieter. I would not say things. I would smile rather than challenge. I would be looser on accountability with staff than I really wanted to be. And it's all that idea of wanting to fit a mold and wanting to find connection with people, and that formative thing of, because of my formative years, it's that thing of, that means I have to mold myself to make myself more acceptable to them. And it was only really in the last few years of my career, and certainly now that I'm a leadership coach, it certainly rings very, very true, that my response to that is, no, you are intimidated. That doesn't mean that I'm intimidating. You feel intimidated. And if you feel intimidated, talk about feeling intimidated and talk about what it is about me that intimidates you. Because that's the narrative. That's the conversation. I'm not intimidating you. Because intimidating someone has to be a conscious act. Doesn't it? You can't
absolutely.
I can't, my subconscious can't make me intimidate somebody. I know, if you're being intimidating, don't you?
Yeah, you're looking to kind of, I don't know if perform is the right way, but for whatever reason, there's something in you that's saying, this is what's required to keep me safe. So it's driven.
Yes,
it's not accidental.
Absolutely. And don't get me wrong, there are times when I've done it. There are times when because it's about survival. If you've had trauma in your, then you know, part of that sort of trauma-informed adverse childhood experiences leads you with having everything is filtered through survival before it is filtered through all the other filters come in. Do I feel safe? Do I feel am I able to survive this? And what do I need to do to get that feeling? So of course I know how to intimidate people. But the amount of times people would come to me, and that was the accusation. I'm not just talking about generally people saying it. I'm talking about like directors of education telling me that I was intimidating, telling me that they had parents or other, they'd had conversation who and they had decided that I was intimidating. So the director of education came at me and said, you need to be less intimidating. And no amount of context seems to get rid of that sense of it's my problem.
Yeah. And we're back to, again, aren't we? We're sort of, blame the individual rather than consider and wonder and be curious about the experience that could have allowed that person to be perceived as intimidating. Yes. We look for that cause and effect of, it must be. It's that we're back to behaviour is something that's done to us.
Absolutely.
But all of the things we've talked about are barriers to connection. And I think now, I think we could probably agree that connection has always been something required. I think a lot of the, have you seen the Rita Pearson TED Talk, the Every Kid Deserves a Champion?
Oh, of course. It's just wonderful, isn't it?
It used to be the video that I had when YouTube first allowed you to download videos offline. It used to be the video that after a sort of wobbly lesson, or I'd been in school for a couple of hours working with a particular group of young people, it used to be the video I'd watched in an art cupboard when I was about ready to tear my hair out to allow myself to regulate, to have a moment and go, right, let's try again. Because connection's something that we have to go looking for. You know, for some of our young people, it doesn't happen naturally and you know, easily. For some of our kids, again, we're back to language. I don't like the term attention seeking. Again, it's one of those labels that is a barrier to connection, because if I say, oh, you're going to be working with little Jack today, but watch out, he's a bit of an attention seeker, instantly I've changed your mindset, and then it becomes something that little Jack can't escape.
No.
But when we think about, you know, how that comes to be, that seeking connection, that flipped sort of language, is we come back to an acknowledgement that for some kids, for some young people, connection doesn't feel accessible. It doesn't feel like something that is offered to them. And for some young people, that means they go looking for it. They can see it around, they're aware it's happening, but then they've got to go searching it out. And that can sometimes feel quite manufactured. I think of the young people that would come and sit next to you in possibly the 3 quiet minutes of a day that you might have, and they throw everything they've got at you. You know, every piece of information about every movie they've ever seen.
It's usually Pokemon.
Oh, Pokemon. It's Minecraft. If I ever go on Mastermind, my specialist subjects will be Minecraft or Cars the movie. Because the wealth of knowledge we acquire by seeking connection is huge. But they throw it all at us. They bombard us with this information. And for some people, you know, they are referred to as having sort of verbal diarrhea or, you know, attention seeking, you know, to get our attention. But then we've got to consider why that is. You know, why is it that for some of our kids, they've got to go looking for that connection? Why is it that their ability to trust connection being something that survives, something that, you know, continues, is so untrusting, is so sporadic, that they kind of throw everything at you all at once in the hope that maybe there'll be something in there that you take interest in that will mean that you come back and talk to me again.
Yeah.
You know, that connection for some isn't something we can just rely on happening organically. We've got to offer opportunities, and regular opportunities, for connection to be looked at, found, you know, nurtured, watered and fed, to keep it going.
Well, listener, if you're anything like Jack and me, you'll probably reach the point of needing a brew or a comfort break, or you're now sitting in your driveway at the end of your commute, trying to work out the best time to switch off and get in the house. So, we've put in this handy break to allow you to do all the above. Join us in part 2 of this opening episode, where we will continue to get curious about belonging and inclusion. See you in a bit.